Good morning, folks. Thank you so much for joining us for our 2022 Budget Training Academy. We're kicking off our web series today. We're going to allow folks a little bit of time to come in from that waiting room. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. All right, folks, we will go ahead and kick things off. Again, welcome. Happy Wednesday. My name is Kelsey Bergfeld. I am the Director of Advocates for Ohio's Future, and we are very happy to be here today, partnering with our friends at the Center for Community Solutions to present the Budget Training Academy. So this will be a webinar series over the next few months, really highlighting the best ways to be prepared for the state budget process. It's never too early to start preparing really what your advocacy is going to look like, some tips and tricks, how to be most effective, as well as making sure that we review things like process and timeline. So we know, again, when we can be best prepared for that process. We do know that the state budget is the General Assembly's biggest and largest policy and funding document that will go through in a 2-year period. And it's about a 5 or 6 month process. So it is certainly a great time, whether you are a brand new advocate or you've been around this cycle for a few times. We hope that you learned something new. We're sure that you'll learn something new over the next few months. And again, we are glad you're here. Very quickly, want to introduce you to Advocates for Ohio's Future, or AOF, as we will refer to it. We are a 2-person team, and we are excited again to partner with our friends at the Center for Community Solutions over this webinar series. AOF is really a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of over 500 state and local health and human services, really policy, advocacy, and provider organizations, really united to make sure that people have what they need to live really healthy and successful lives in fantastic communities. We really believe in investing in people. They are truly our state's greatest resource to make sure that opportunities exist and that, again, folks can thrive in their communities. Just to give you a little bit of an idea more about AOF, we do have a steering committee that guides our work. It's really represented by a wide variety of folks from different health and human service sectors, again, acknowledging and knowing that many are intersectional and that we have to really address a whole person, a whole family, and really all of their basic needs in order to achieve success and, again, create those healthy families and healthy communities. So just, you can see here on the screen a number of the sectors and really kind of those health and human service issues that are represented within Advocates for Ohio's Future. Again, we work together to identify priorities and ensure that, again, all of our issues are being addressed at once. And then up next, a couple frequently asked questions. Don't you worry. This webinar is being recorded in full. It will be available up on our website and will also be sent directly to you tomorrow if you registered for the training. We will also send along those slides, and they will live forever on AOF's website. There it is, advocatesforohiosfuture.org. Budget Training Academy. They will be there forever. And that at any time during today's training, you are welcome to submit questions via the chat or the Q&A box. We will pause a couple different times throughout today's presentation to address those. So don't you worry, we will get to all questions. No worries at all. So from here, I'm very excited to introduce Center for Community Solutions Director of Policy and Advocacy, Tarter Britton, as well as AOF's co-chair. So Tara, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. And we're really excited to partner with Advocates for Ohio's Future this time around on our Budget Training Academy. Some of you may have attended events that either of our organizations have hosted in the past, but every even numbered year ahead of when the state budget process starts in the odd numbered years, we have hosted a budget training to really unpack and sort of demystify the state budget process, if you will. The Center for Community Solutions has, hosted events like this over many years, decades, I think at this point, to really help folks engage in the budget process. And our organization overall seeks to improve health, social, and economic conditions through nonpartisan research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy. And we'll talk a little bit about how we engage in advocacy through both Will and my presentation, heading into the presentation from Assistant Director Frass from the Office of Budget and Management, who can really tell us, a lot about how that process works. You'll see here our policy priority areas. There's a lot of overlap with some of the things that Advocates for Ohio's Future has been focusing on, as well as, overall, these are the priorities we really focus on through the state budget process. And so kind of looking at all of these issues through the lens of state policy and how we engage there. So I will come back and present a little bit later about our engagement and advocacy, but I'm first going to turn it over to my colleague, William Tarter Jr., who has, I think, can probably give advocacy trainings in his sleep at this point, but he's also, always the most engaging presenter as it relates to how to really dig in on learning how to be an effective advocate. So take it away, Will. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara, for the introduction. Thank you so much to the Advocates for Ohio's Future for the invitation to present at today's event. I am not asleep. I have my second cup of coffee already, so I'm ready to go, Tara, and excited to be here with all of you. As you know, there is a lot going on in the policy world, even in 2022. And going into 2023, there is going to be a lot of things that are decided through the budget process, both at the state level as well as at the local levels as well. And one of the things that's going to be really important is how we engage with our policymakers. How do we communicate what's going on in our respective organizations, in the communities that we serve? How do we share that information with the policymakers who are making decisions on funding and policies that impact organizations that serve the community? And during the pandemic, I think we have really seen the importance of communicating conditions on the ground in the community, things that are going on that disproportionately have impacted communities across the country and across the state. And I believe it's so important to make sure that as advocates and as organizational representatives, that we share that information in real time with elected officials, and that we also educate our communities on what's going on at the state level that is so important for them to pay attention to. A lot of people get really excited before Election Day, and rightfully so. But as many of you know, it is just as important to stay involved after Election Day, because that's when a lot of the major decisions get made. As we head into next year, especially, we're going to have new faces and seats as well. And so it creates an education opportunity for elected officials to learn more about you, about the organization that you work for, about the community you serve, the constituents you represent. And it's our goal through this presentation in advocacy to understand some basic communication principles that you can put into your toolbox, and then you can complement the messaging and the data, the stories that you have generated in your respective organizations, and share that and be an effective advocate throughout this process. Tara will get more into the actual process itself, when and where to engage. But today we're going to talk more high level in communication principles that you can take with you, not just during the budget process, but ongoing throughout the legislative term as well. We call this training Advocacy 101, and this is actually part of a much larger presentation on advocacy tips and suggestions. If you'd like for us to present the longer presentation, we're happy to do that. But today we're going to present the slimmed down version, about 30 minutes or so. We call this part Advocacy 101. Again, just focusing on the basics. So with that, let's begin. All right, so some of our goals for today's presentation we are going to explore the difference between lobbying and advocacy. We get this question a lot, especially from nonprofits, in terms of what they can and cannot do. We're also going to explore 4 effective advocacy methods, and we've tailored a portion of this presentation to also fit into the virtual environment in which we find many of our engagements with our elected officials and organizational decision makers. And then we'll close with how to communicate effectively with elected officials, because again, it's not just what you communicate, but also how you engage with others in creating and formulating an effective message. Next slide. All right, so why should we advocate? We are very fortunate and thankful to have many organizations, both regionally and across the state, who serve the public. Public service is an honorable calling, and we respect and appreciate all the great work that organizations are doing and service providers are providing in programs that impact the community, especially in present day with the continued effects of the pandemic. But we also must recognize that government policies affect everyone. Government policies and programs, procedures, and rules, they are instrumental and impactful to the work that we do and the effectiveness of the work that we do in serving the community. Also understand that government controls funding for many of these important services. So it's not just the programs and the policies that get created, but also the funding levels that can significantly impact the ability or inability to reach people who need it. Policymakers care about and they need your expertise. And I cannot underscore this enough. When you reach out to a policymaker, you are reaching out to a person who has been elected into a position, but he or she may have a variety of different backgrounds and experiences that led them to that position. So don't necessarily assume that they know the intricacies of the issues that you are aware about and concerned about on a regular basis. It may take time to talk with them and explain how things work in your particular field or environment. They need to hear your perspective, your input. That is so very, very important. Assume nothing. Also, when you reach out to policymakers, they might have a understanding of the topic or issue, but again, you can bring your perspective. Maybe you're from a different part of the state. Maybe you reach different areas than perhaps they are engaging with and can speak on the impact of a particular issue in your area that they might not necessarily be familiar with or might have some common misconceptions. So whenever you feel any type of hesitancy to reach out and engage and educate, understand that policymakers need to hear your voice. They need to know your experience and how the policies and programs impact you and the people that you serve. Next slide. All right, so we're gonna boil this down into 3 different buckets: education, advocacy, and lobbying. Education is literally just educating, being a resource for these policymakers. When you are educating, you're sharing information, you're sharing data from your particular organization, the impact of a particular program on the community. So you're literally just being a resource, a go-to if a legislator or lawmaker needs it. Advocacy is working on issues. So you're talking about the impacts of the programs on your community and maybe why it's been so helpful or why something could be potentially harmful. So you're basically not necessarily saying vote yes or no on this, but you're talking about the impact of particular issues on the constituents of the programs that you are affiliated with. Lobbying is working on bills. It's trying to influence a particular decision or action. And we'll get into the specifics in just a moment. Next slide. All right, so let's define advocacy. Advocacy is a public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. So if you're talking about something that it is impacting your community, when we talk about food insecurity, or if we're talking about the financial impact of scams. You're talking about things that go on that impact your community and saying this is something that is detrimental to our community. When we're talking about access to food, how it's so important, but it's become especially more so over the past few years. So if we're talking about transportation, how important that is to be supported and maintained and maybe even expanded because it will allow people to get to food or medical appointments. So you're basically talking about policy support or recommendation on a particular topic or issue. It's often used in the promotion of a goal that leads a promotion of a cause that leads to a selected goal. So if you're saying that, I'm going to use older adults as an example. Older adults are a critical component of our community. We're an aging city, in an aging county, an aging state, and an aging country. How will the demographic changes that we know are coming going to impact our communities? How can we make sure that we have a high quality of life for our older adults, so that individuals are able to age with dignity? So with that, we're advocating for the prioritization of older adults and making sure that they are included in many policy conversations that take place. That is an example of advocacy. Now, advocacy is just one way to approach a problem. There is also activism and other methods of communication where you are making a direct communication with your lawmaker on a particular cause or issue. So advocacy is just one tool in the toolbox for policy engagement. Advocacy does not necessarily involve confrontation or conflict. And this is something, again, where we're sitting down and we're talking about your particular causes or issues, but it's also going to be important to listen to the perspectives and feedback of the elected official and find areas of intersection. We're going to talk about some of those specifics in just a few moments. Now, contrast that with lobbying. Lobbying is working to, let's go back, working to influence the outcome of a specific piece of legislation or executive agency decision. And the key word here is working. So when you're getting paid to do that, that is a big line in terms of engagement. We're talking about two types of lobbying. There's direct lobbying, where you interact with a decision maker, or grassroots lobbying, where you're encouraging others to interact with the decision maker. Now, when you are as a private citizen on your own time, you have a First Amendment right to engage with your policymaker and tell them about things that are important to you and things that you care about in a specific piece of legislation that you oppose or support. But when you are working on behalf of an organization to do some of those very same things, then you are into the lobbying category. Now, lobbying is a legal term defined by IRS regulations and state and federal law, and it's really important to understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying, because money that's spent on lobbying needs to be tracked, and there are limits in terms of what you can spend and what you can do as an organization. So make sure that you talk to your organizational legal counsel in terms of what you can and cannot do in terms of advocacy versus lobbying. Also, there are varying degrees of nonprofits that can advocate. You can have 100% of your time advocating, and then there's some organizations that can do a portion of their time advocating and educating, and all of those are defined by the IRS. So please make sure that you're aware of your particular IRS designation. But I want to encourage organizations to be aware of the importance as a nonprofit of not just educating, but if you do choose to advocate, that can be very helpful, again, to policymakers without necessarily lobbying. And again, don't use that as a opportunity to withdraw. This is something where you just need to be aware of what the differences are. All right, next slide. All right, so when we're talking about communication, one of the things that's really important is to figure out how can policymakers be open to the argument that you're making or the points that you're making. And we're going to go through some recommendations that can really help with that conversation. The first thing is if they have a relationship with you and your organization. and not just around budget season. This is something that should be an ongoing thing, because when budget comes around, understand that there are a lot of organizations, a lot of people reaching out to them to ask for funding of their particular cause or issue. But if your policymaker is aware of who you are, the organization you represent, the constituents that you serve, and that is something that perhaps could have started right after Election Day. If you send a note to them saying congratulations on your election, we look forward to working with you, sharing information about the organization that we are and the people that we serve, that can be the beginning of an ongoing relationship, not just before a budget season, but also afterwards, and maintaining that relationship over time. They have to have reason to trust the information that you present. I can remember an instance not too long ago where there was a person who was providing testimony, and the person who was an elected official, they asked this witness to describe a graph that was being shown. And the witness said, "I'd never seen that graph before." And as it turned out, and I'll shorten the story for the sake of time, but the data had been intentionally manipulated to be misleading to the public. And when the witness said, "I don't think that that's the way that that really looks," it really was an embarrassing opportunity. It was an embarrassing moment for that elected official, because the data that they had presented had been misrepresented by an organization, an interest group that had manipulated the data to make it look like a worse problem than it actually was. And so elected officials have to have reason to trust the information that you present, that you give to them, because likely they will be sharing that information with others. Policymakers need to know who you speak for. So if you are speaking on behalf of your organization, maybe 50 people, or maybe you're speaking on behalf of a conglomerate, if you're speaking on behalf of a federation, or you're speaking on behalf of a nursing home where you have 300 voters and 300 individuals, understand that you need to share that information with policymakers, so they know, again, are you speaking as yourself as a citizen? Are you speaking to yourself as an executive director of an organization? Or are you speaking on behalf of others? Also, how you relate to their community and their constituents. Many times, organizations can provide data that is specific to a lawmaker's district. And that's very helpful, because when we're talking about things like Medicaid expansion or broadband accessibility, you can tailor the arguments that you're making to that particular House district or Senate district, and say, this is how this issue affects your community and your constituents. I know that's very effective. The food banks do a great job of sharing of some of the data that's specific to a person's district. I also want to put a plug in for our community fact sheets at communitysolutions.com. You can go to resources, click community fact sheets, and you can find the community fact sheets for state house, state senate districts, also counties across the state, and large cities, among other topics. So you can find that information, that data, then use that to complement your argument and your conversations. Also, they should know if you have strong media relationships. So if this is something that perhaps you want to share across media platforms, help kind of amplify the issue, maybe this is something that's very important to their office, and they want to use this as an opportunity to express their support or concern about a particular cause or issue. If you have those media relationships, make sure that you include that in your conversations with them. Go to the next slide. All right. So we're going to go through a little bit quickly, but we'll try our best to do this in a timely manner. The personal phone call, personal letter, personal visit, even if it's virtual, and personal email. And what do these four things have in common? Personal. So if this sermon had a title, it would be Make It Personal. No one knows your argument better than you. All right, next slide. So personal phone call. When you call an elected official's office, the first thing to keep in mind is do not expect to speak to the legislator, him or herself. All right, so just set that expectation beforehand. If you call Senator Brown's office, or you call Senator Portman's office, or you call any state representative, don't necessarily expect to speak with his or her, that individual. But who you will speak to is their staff. And the staff speaks to that legislator. So be nice, be pleasant to the staff, because they catch a lot of flack and a lot of input from the community, and some people were very angry, and some people are very passionate. So you hear a whole lot of things coming in as a staff person. So be nice to them. Ask them their name if you're speaking to them, and that's a great way to establish rapport with the person. Also allows for you to document who you spoke to if you need to reference that in future phone calls. So be nice to them, because again, you might not necessarily be speaking with the legislator, but you're speaking with their staff who speaks with legislators. So treat them as if you're speaking to the elected official, him or herself. Let them know if you are a constituent, but phone ID can tell them that already. One of the things that's really helpful is when you can say, I'm speaking on behalf of 30 people in my organization. We're all residents of this particular area, and we want to share with you some concerns that we have about X, Y, and Z. So again, if you're a constituent, it makes it even more powerful, because you're not you're calling, but you're also a potential vote, right? So it's really important that they keep in contact with you. Try to sound like yourself. Many times organizations will provide a sample script for engagement with lawmakers, and there's nothing wrong with having some talking points or a pre-drawn up script. But one of the things that you don't want to do is to sound like a robot. So like, hi, my name is William Tarter. I would like to share with you my thoughts concerning X, Y, and Z. Versus, hi, my name is Will Tarter. I want to talk to you about an issue that's really important to me, something that has affected my family for several years, X, Y, and Z. So you're not just talking about a particular script or something that someone has written up for you. You're talking from the heart, something that's impacted you, whether that's gun violence or health issues or something like that. You can literally share your story, and that is extremely powerful, extremely poignant. So what gives you expertise and what gives you credibility? Establish that from the outset. When you say, I've been working in this particular field for 20 years, I have seen people from all walks of life, and I can tell you that whenever a person comes in seeking treatment, they're looking for X, and I believe that this bill would harm the ability to do whatever. So again, you're talking about your experience, your expertise, your credibility, and you're speaking to that from the very beginning and saying you've seen this, and this is something that expresses concern or something that you support, and you want to offer that feedback. But keep it short. Again, there's a lot of phone calls coming in, a lot of people trying to communicate. And so if you can keep things short and concise, that is really great, as opposed to going on into a long story. But be a good listener. And this is something that I would really, if I could, underline and bold and italicize, because one of the things that's really interesting is, again, everyone wants to be heard. So when you're sharing your story and you're sharing your passion about a particular cause or issue, that's really important that you share that. But you also want to see what's the perspective and the viewpoint of the person who I'm talking to. Where are they on the issue? And see if you can find an intersecting point and say, you know what, I agree with you on that. And I would like to assist you with helping to explore that a little bit further. And you understand where they are in an issue and perhaps where you want them to go by being a good listener and hearing where they're at. Also have a clear ask. If you say, hey, I would love to follow up with you on this particular cause or issue, I would love to invite you to a particular event or an open house or something like that, or a follow-up opportunity. I'd love to follow up with you in a month or so, maybe talk through some of these issues as it goes through the process, which Tara is about to talk about. So again, have a clear ask, some sort of follow-up after the phone call is complete. Next slide. All right, personal letter. If we were in person, I would do a show of hands and ask how many people still write letters. How many people write thank you notes? And the reality is that a lot of things are electronic means of communication, whether it's social media or emails, and less individuals are taking the time out to write a letter. And so when you do write a letter, you need to go find a piece of paper. You need to find a pen that works. You need to sit down and write it out, put it into an envelope, find a stamp, go to the mailbox, mail it. So it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy. And when you write a letter that you took that time out to send that to an individual, that is extremely meaningful in communication. And one of the things, an example of this is I remember I was at a local senior center, and they were engaging with a congressman, and they're talking about food insecurity. And they had a group of older adults write down their stories of how difficult it was to get food, and they wrote it on a paper plate. And when they had this round table with the congressman, the executive director of the center presented the stack of paper plates to the congressman, sharing the stories and experiences of the elders that were in that room. I tell you, you could hear a pin drop. It was an extremely powerful moment and very memorable as well, because they took the time out to write down their stories and to share that through, in that particular manner, a personal letter. All right, so keep that in mind. That is extremely powerful tool. Many of the same communication principles from the personal phone call you'll see here relate your experiences. No one knows your story better than you, so make sure that you share that. Keep it short. Again, you don't want to have like 4 or 5 pages of that personal letter. If you can keep things to a page, maybe page and a half, that would be the best. Address one issue, because a lot of times, again, attention spans tend to be shorter. And so you really want to make sure that if you have a particular topic or issue, that you stay focused on that issue. If you do handwritten, again, that is very powerful, because again, you take time to write that out. Not saying don't type up a letter and sign your name. Of course, people can do that. But if you can do handwritten, that's preferable. Always include your home address. Many legislators will, if they don't reply back personally to your letter, they will at least write an acknowledgement letter of that particular issue, and you can keep that for your records. And always ask for a reply and say, I would love to talk with you. I would love to meet with you. If you have any questions about this, happy to assist or be a resource, so on and so forth. So again, if you have the opportunity to ask for a reply, please consider doing that. Next slide. All right, so here's a letter example. When you write out your letter and you're putting it into the card, write the honorable elected official's name, the governing body, if you're sending it to their office, and the address of the governing body. One tip, please try and spell their name correctly, because it's an attention to detail, again, that says that you took the time out to look up the title, to look up the address, all of those things in putting this together. And that stuff really matters when you're sending it in. So make sure that you spell the name correctly. So an example here, the Honorable Congresswoman Chantel Brown, we're in her district, United States House of Representatives, District Office, Warrensville Heights, Ohio, 44128. Next slide, please. All right, the personal visit. Even if it's virtual, many of these principles still apply. Schedule the meeting in advance. There is a very slim chance that you'll encounter a meeting at a legislator's office if you've not scheduled the meetings in advance. Some schedules are put together months in advance, with blocks of time specifically put into place for the actual meeting or event, travel time if necessary, and sometimes there's personal events that might take place during the day that will take up their time. So you want to make sure if you can schedule a meeting in advance that you do so. Schedule a meeting with the legislators and other constituents if possible. So if you want to schedule that meeting with the legislator and the legislative aide and yourself, that's 3 people already. So if there's other individuals who you would like to bring who can perhaps speak to the issue through their own experience, you want to communicate that in advance. And the reason is when you go and you meet with that person or the legislator in their office, there might only be 3 chairs and someone's going to be left standing. So it's going to be kind of awkward if you have people who are not able to sit in that meeting to stand the whole time. If a legislative aide can go find a conference room or a larger room where people can be seated, that is something that they would want to know in advance so they can reserve the space. You don't want to have too many constituents though, because when you have too many people, that's a lot of information coming at that legislator or the legislative aide at one time. So you want to really be cognizant of how many people you bring with you if you intend to sit down and have a meeting with them. Dress appropriately. If you are going down to the State House, it is a business professional environment. And if you have individuals who have uniforms, that is also a very powerful scene. If you have individuals who are in, nurses' uniforms or construction uniforms or whatever, that's something that's also, very powerful in kind of sharing your message through nonverbal communication. Be on time, early if possible, but don't be surprised if you have to wait. I mentioned that things can get really busy and you want to make sure that if you can get there on time, that's preferable. But if you do have to wait because committee meetings go over or something like that, don't be surprised. So start with a compliment. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I appreciate you taking the time, and then go into whatever issue, state briefly, clearly, and concisely the issue that you want. It allows for them to focus on whatever the issue is at hand, and then they can share with you their thoughts or their perspective and feedback. Personalize the issue, and that's something that, again, I want to encourage people to share their stories in that personal visit. Be a good listener, find out where they are in that particular issue, and then have a clear ask. Again, many of these same principles. One thing that is really important, we're talking about being a good listener. The reason why that's really important is because sometimes where you think a legislator is or their staff could be in a very different place than where they actually are. So your preconceived notions could inform, kind of what you think they're going to say. That could be entirely not the case. I haven't seen instances where you have legislative officials who you talk with and you're like, I think they're really going to be against this issue and they're not going to be open to what I have to say. When in fact, sometimes they will have gone through a similar experience and they can relate to what you're talking about. And you can talk through creative solutions on how to work together to solve those things. So don't assume that you know exactly where they are on a particular issue. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier about the importance of calling and making sure that people are informed of your particular perspective on an issue. A common phrase that I use is, if everyone assumes that everyone else is calling, then no one is calling. I'll say that again. If everyone assumes that everyone else is calling, then no one is calling. And so that's one thing I really want to encourage you is to call in, to email, or to write, whatever it is, provide that input, because legislators, they are aware not just of the content of the phone calls and the letters and the emails that come in, but also the numbers of calls, of emails, of letters that come in on a particular cause or issue. And that matters. So not just the content, but also the quantity. So make sure that you provide the input, because that stuff does matter. Next slide, please. Okay. The personal email. Sometimes in the legislators, things move fast, both state and federal, and sometimes they move faster than snail mail. I talk about, getting all those things for a letter, and sometimes, when you got it to the elected official, it's already passed out of the committee or gone to something else. So sometimes the personal email is that opportunity for you to send a quick message. And again, you want to be aware of different things that you should and should not do in the personal emails. And so when you write out the email, you're taking the time to share your story, your experience. So don't make it too long, because no one has time for that. To keep it clear and concise. Again, when you're sharing your story and your concerns, you want to make sure that that can be captured in a quick email. And that's preferred to, say, a form letter email, where, again, going back to the personal phone call, if you have like a script, that's one thing where it is kind of a pre-packaged communication form. And sometimes you'll see form emails where the title of the email will be the exact same. The body and the content is the exact same for like 50 different emails that come in. That's one thing. But if you have a person who writes in with their particular story that might be unique from 49 other individuals, that stuff is memorable. That stuff makes a difference. So be sure that you share your story in that personal email. Next slide, please. All right, social media. And I know I'm getting close to my time, Kelsey, so I will try my best to, to hurry up a little bit. With social media, a lot of elected officials will have social media and platforms. You want to make sure that you use that as an opportunity to educate yourself, educate others, educate the elected officials. Don't be afraid to talk to your legislators via social media. You can tag them in posts to start conversations or to inform. You can encourage your followers to share or retweet posts from your legislators or talk with legislators directly. But one thing that I want to caution, especially around social media, is that you can control what you post on social media. You cannot control what people post after you. You can control what you post. You cannot control what people post after you. So be very, very careful if you tag a legislator on something, because if you create a hive or a huge issue where people have a whole bunch of vitriol and anger on that particular cause or issue, then sometimes people who are reading that will associate that with you because of what you posted and what people responded to. So be very, very careful if you do choose to engage on social media versus the other forms of communication that we talked about. You can use graphics, tables, photos, or videos to access your points. Again, making it very simple, easy, digestible for elected officials to see, read, observe, and understand. If you're using emails, do not, and I did put this in italicized, do not use all capital letters. Why? Because it's going to seem like you're yelling. When we talk about verbal communication and nonverbal communication, so much of nonverbal communication is hand gestures, eye contact, and you lose all of that in emails. And so when you write out and you put something in capital letters, it's almost as if you're screaming at the recipient. So do not use all capital letters if you can avoid it. All right, next slide. All right, that's me. So this again was a very abbreviated advocacy 101 presentation. We wanted to use this to look at the high level communication principles. So when you do choose to engage, whether it's at the House or the Senate, before election day or after election day, you know exactly how to communicate in an effective manner. If you have any questions, I'll be around for the Q&A towards the latter part, but feel free to send me an email or you can check us out on social media. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today, and I'll now turn it back over to Tara.
Thanks so much, Will. And I just want to emphasize that there's so much more we can share on that front. And Will really condensed it down, but I think effectively to really get at the key points. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that we engage in the policymaking process, give a little bit of context for how things work at the State House, and then we'll turn it over to our guest speaker from the Ohio Office of Budget and Management here in a little while to really dig in kind of on the executive branch side of how the budget process works. So just a couple of ways that we engage in policymaking. We follow legislation through the committee hearing process. So this is true of the state budget, which follows a bit of a different process, and then traditional pieces of legislation that are pertinent to the issue areas that Community Solutions follows. And this would be true for all of you and the issue areas that you follow. We connect with legislators based on their issue areas of interest. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think this is sort of a good reminder as we head into the primary and general election season to really pay attention to, the things that folks are talking most about in their campaigning. What issue areas interest them? Where can you find those common areas? Where can you provide additional education that would kind of enhance their understanding of an issue that they already have some interest in or background in? We also offer testimony. So I'm not going to get too far into that. That's actually part of our advocacy 201 around how to engage in the testimony process. But I will talk a little bit about how to get good notification, or at least as best as you can, notification of when those opportunities arise to testify. And then we also connect with other stakeholders. And so I think, looking through the list of folks who are on this webinar today, and I think we'll join many of our other webinars, and Kelsey will talk about how we'll conclude this series with an in-person event in November. I think just connecting with folks who are working on other issues that you care about is really important. So moving into kind of the engaging with policymakers piece, Will gave a lot of great tips about what the mechanics really are of engaging with them. But I wanted to add here the ways in which you can connect directly with your legislators. This link will be live in the slides that we share in the post-meeting materials. So you'll be able to click here, enter your address, enter all the specifics, including the extra 4 digits on your zip code, and you should be able to get to your specific legislator. You can also do this for, the location of an agency, or if you're a service provider where you provide services, so that you're able to say, look, we provide services in your district. I am going to talk more about staying up to date on legislation by connecting with the committee chairs' offices. And this is actually I feel like this is a little bit of inside track State House information, but really the best way to get the information about when different bills have been introduced and will be heard is to really get on the contact list for the committee chairs' offices. And so we're looking ahead to a pretty busy, we anticipate, period after the election before the end of this General Assembly, known as the lame duck period. So I think getting on those contact lists is really important. So you can use the legislature's website to find the contact information for legislators. Each committee is listed out. You'll be able to see who the chair is. You can contact their office, and they would be happy to add you to the committee contact list. And then I won't spend too much time on talking about meetings, since Will really talked about the nuance of in-person, virtual, in-district meetings. But I will just add here on in-district meetings, take the opportunity to provide tours or additional education to legislators in their district with, agencies and service providers that provide services there. They really, I hear stories all of the time from legislators who said, I visited this agency, they told me all about this, I saw the services they're providing, it's really important. What can I do to help them? So I think those in-district visits are really key. Generally, this is the legislative process. Like I said, there's a little bit of a different process for the state budget, and I won't spend too much time on that because I know our guest speaker from OBM will be happy to walk through that. But really, it comes from an idea for a policy change. The Legislative Service Commission, which is the agency that staffs the legislature in terms of research and bill drafting, will put the bill together. A bill is introduced and then referred to a committee. And so that's where it's important to track which committee it's running through. The Legislative Service Commission also produces additional documents. I have a slide later on to show you where to find those, but there's also a bill analysis and oftentimes a fiscal analysis if that is relevant for the particular bill. The committee then hears sponsor testimony, so from the legislator or legislators who are sponsoring the bill. Then there's proponent, opponent, and interested party testimony opportunities. Those typically go in that order, although sometimes those are sort of combined on different days. So again, it's really important to watch those committee notices. And then the committee votes the bill out if, that's the will of the committee, moves it to the full chamber, so either the House or the Senate, wherever it starts for a vote. Then it moves over to the other chamber of the legislature for this same process. And then, if it passes, would move to the governor's desk. So that's the general process, sort of how a bill becomes a law. You all remember that, but that's the general process we follow in Ohio. Here are some just examples of what the resource pages look like for the legislature. So you'll see here the Ohio Legislature General website where you can search legislation. So you would put in the number, the piece of legislation would come up, and all of the associated documents. You'll see also the Ohio Legislative Service Commission website is a little shrunk here, but you'll get these slides afterward to be able to see additional documents. This is really a key resource during the state budget because they'll do an analysis of every state agency's budget. There's also home pages here from the Ohio House of Representatives and the Ohio Senate, and that's where you can find all of the committees within each of those chambers and their chairs. This is what a notice looks like, that once you're on the email list for the committee. This is just an example from the Ohio House Finance Committee. The chair currently is Representative Olslager, so you can see here Representative Plummer is the vice chair, and Representative Sweeney is the ranking minority member on the committee. You also see little buttons there that show you, where you can find all of the members, all of the meetings. They'll include, the meeting minutes and also testimony that occurred during those particular hearings. These committee notices that go out via email will tell you the date, time, location, what bills will be heard. And there's also, information on the status. So you can see who's testifying, if they're going to add an amendment, if it's going to be voted on that day. All of that information is on the committee notice. Really quickly, this is what you'll see when you kind of dive further into the legislature's website on individual pieces of legislation. So this is just an example, House Bill 496. It'll show you the primary sponsors of the bill. And then all of these little sort of that burgundy area that's highlighted where it says summary gives you a summary status. Under documents will show you the bill analysis and some of the sort of, you can see the original text, but also will offer you information that is a little bit more clear in terms of what the bill is aiming to do. And then I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I just wanted you to have these slides, so I included them here. The state budget process follows a little bit different process, and this is the general timeline. Starts with the governor's budget proposal, then moves through the House, and then moves through the Senate. But the nuance here is there are some in both the House and the Senate subcommittees that spend a significant amount of time digging into the details of the budget, and those are organized around topic areas. So both in the House and the Senate, there will be a subcommittee process prior to the full committee process. The subcommittees really dig into health and human services or education or transportation. There's all different opportunities to engage in that subcommittee process. It's also a smaller group of legislators who will hear the bill during that process. So it's really important to particularly engage with those individuals. So I sort of did that rapid fire, so we have enough time for a few questions that I think came in through the course of the first part of our presentation. Happy to answer those in the next about 6 minutes before we turn it over to Assistant Director Frass.
Great, Tara, you're right. We have a couple questions that came in through our Q&A, and keep them coming in again through the Q&A or through the chat, whatever is best for you. Again, Will and Tara will stick around for the next few minutes. So Will, I believe the first question is for you. How many people is ideal for an in-person meeting?
All right, so great question. It depends on the topic. It depends on the duration of the meeting. It also depends on where you're meeting. Sometimes you can have meetings at your particular office where you invite a legislator to come and attend an event or attend a meeting or something like that, where again, it's an opportunity for them to listen and them to learn. Sometimes it's an opportunity for you to invite a legislator and they can meet with your staff. So maybe it's like 2 or 3 of the staff members, maybe you have a constituent in the room with you. But if you're going down to Columbus and you're sitting down and meeting with a state house representative, for example, in some of their offices, you have the legislator's desk and 2 chairs. And that's it. And so if you have the legislator, the legislative aide, and you, then that's it. And I think that that's one thing you want to be aware of is asking, if you're going to have an in-person meeting, how many people can you bring? If you do have some individuals who are coming with you, if you might have one person who might be able to come and speak to a particular issue, then perhaps they can find a small conference room or something like that. So I think it really depends on the limits of the room. If it's virtual, you don't necessarily have that same type of limitation, but I would still encourage you not to have too many individuals who are speaking, because you could have a number of different perspectives. They could be talking over each other. And I think sometimes, especially if you're trying to get a particular point across, you have the higher likelihood of messaging that either competes with each other or becomes mixed or muddled. And so you want to make sure, if you have a particular point that you're trying to get across, if you have maybe one person who can really speak to that issue, speak to that point using their own experience, that's really where you want to hone in on. So maybe limiting it to like 1 or maybe 2 individuals. So it really depends on the circumstances, but I would encourage you not to have too many that the message could become muddled.
Wonderful, Will. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is also heading your way.
Okay.
Sure. So how do you choose the ideal form of communication for your different intentions? For example, you mentioned that congrats message when the first elected officials or first take office. Should that be an email, a phone call, handwritten letter? Really, how do you determine what medium to use?
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for that question. It also can depend on the office. It can also depend on if they have a transition team or something like that. So it really kind of depends on the particular office. One thing that I would really encourage people to do is remember the power of a handwritten note. I remember several times where people who have assumed office received congratulatory notes that were sent in, and a lot of times they will include a business card in that note, and so you can reference that later on. You can say, hey, I sent you a congratulatory note, look forward to working with you, or if you have any questions on this particular issue, we're happy to provide data. What that does is that establishes a foundation upon which to build that relationship, but also allows for the future legislator to learn about the conditions of his or her district. And that's something that is really helpful as they head into the policymaking process. So I would encourage you, whoever asked the question, I would encourage you to do a handwritten letter or postcard that can be very quick, doesn't have to be anything super long, but include a business card that could be very helpful. I would also encourage following up in, say, a few weeks after you send that, and say, hey, just wanted to see if you had any questions, or if you have an event, invite them to that event as the legislator-elect. And one thing, this might be a little bit unconventional, but in the time before election day, you can invite candidates to candidate forums. You can invite them to learn about issues. Again, so provided that you do this to all candidates in their particular race, but you can definitely learn it as use this as a civic education and introduction opportunity before election day, so that whoever gets elected knows who you are, what your organization does. So don't lose out on that window before election day to also engage with legislators. And that provides a good springboard into after election day and another springboard into after they are sworn into office.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we've got one more. We've got about 60 seconds or less. So I
Okay.
know you can do it. I know you can do this one. For local agencies, should they direct their advocacy to their local elected representatives, so those in their district, to carry their concerns to committee members if they don't sit on the committee, or should organizations direct their advocacy directly to committee members who are hearing a specific bill?
I actually would defer down to Sarah and Kelsey, because you guys know the committee members. I would just say that sometimes you want to ask the legislators who are on that committee what they think, because sometimes they'll have a pulse for how the committee meetings go. But I'll defer to you guys to provide your expertise in that 60 seconds.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, I think it's really important to have a relationship with the representatives and senators from your district, regardless. But to actually move things through a committee, it is really imperative, I think, to connect with the chair's office and the members of the committee that are hearing your particular issue. They'll likely ask you, if you've talked to your local representative, to say, hey, are they pushing this on your behalf? Are they working on this issue? And it's a good thing to be able to say, yes, I have had that conversation. But the nuance of the bill will likely be best known by the committee chair and the members of the committee.
Yeah, nothing worse than showing up to provide testimony and it's a surprise to your elected officials on that committee. So you definitely want to.
Very good point. Yes. Yep. Well, I think
that will do it for questions. Yep, go ahead, take it away.
I think we successfully made it through and almost exactly on time. To have our guest speaker join us. So I just want to quickly introduce OBM Assistant Director Christina Frass. She has nearly 20 years of state service and has served as the Assistant Director of OBM since March of 2021. Prior to her current role, she served as the Chief Operating Officer at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Chief Financial Officer at the Ohio Attorney General's Office, and has a lot of experience in the budget planning for the state. We're really excited for her to join us today and provide some of that insight into the process. So I will turn it over to you, Assistant Director. We're gonna have some time for your presentation and we'll do questions the same way, submit them through the Q&A or chat box. So thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. It's an exciting time here at OBM. So this is very timely, a timely discussion. Okay, somebody advance. So I wanted to start out with, what does OBM do? What's our role? So our mission is to provide financial management and policy analysis for the responsible use of state resources. So really, we are our whole agency mission is to be good stewards of public dollars. Next. So how do we do that? One of the biggest roles that we play is we coordinate, develop, and monitor agency operating and capital budgets. So from end to end. We also own and operate the state accounting system. So we review, process, and report all the financial transactions made by state agencies and provide that fiduciary role for reporting, providing the federal reports on a statewide basis. And we also assist the governor and state agencies by providing policy and management support for the state's activities. As you well know, nothing gets done if it doesn't have funding. So, marrying the programmatic with the dollars to accomplish the priorities of the administration is a central role of OBM. So the state fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th. And we have offsetting operating and capital budget cycles. So the fiscal year 22-23 operating budget, we have budgets for 2 years. Started, we just started fiscal year 2023 on July 1 and closed out fiscal year 22. So we're in the second year of the current operating biennium. And the operating budgets are really split into 4 different legislative vehicles. The main operating budget, the transportation budget, which includes highway funding and some for public safety, the Bureau of Workers' Compensation budget, and then the Ohio Industrial Commission budget. So those are all operating budgets on the fiscal year 22-23 cycle. Then starting in an odd year, we do a capital budget. So fiscal year 2023-24 capital budget was just passed. And that will become effective here in September. And so we are in the first year of the capital budget cycle and the second year of the operating budget cycle right now. So OBM really budgets every single year. Okay. All right, so high level, we can chunk the budget process into preparation period, which really started, July. It starts this month and it goes through February of 2023. The legislative process, which starts in February once the bill is introduced and goes through June of 2023. And then for OBM, implementation starts July of 2023 through June of 2024. And then OBM has the audit and evaluation period from 2024 to 2026. So that is a whole operating budget process from the OBM perspective. So now a little more detailed. So this is kind of a flow chart for the steps in the current operating budget process. So, all year round, agencies, directors, deputy directors meet with stakeholders to get feedback, get insight into how to implement their programs effectively to achieve their goals. Yesterday, OBM released the budget guidance for the upcoming 24-25 budget process that really tells agencies, here's how you compile your budgets to submit them to OBM. So August through September, agencies are going to work now to determine what their priorities are, working with their budget leadership teams and their program areas to really decide what is going to go into our budget package to request from OBM. Then late September and early October, the agencies will be finalizing the details, coordinating with the governor's policy team in order to submit their budget. We have rolling submission deadlines. Smaller agencies are going earlier in October. Larger cabinet agencies, budgets will be due late October, and then the elected offices are due November 1st. So that's, so I stepped on that one. So the budget requests are due to OBM then. So then really the work starts with our analysts, and in mid to late October, our analysts will do a technical review to make sure all the components are there and nothing is left out or missing or out of order. And then in November, the analysts start to review from a policy perspective, asking follow-up questions and providing analysis. In December, OBM prepares initial preliminary recommendations, and we start meeting with the governor's office, their team, to talk through the requests and recommendations for the next budget. And in January, the executive budget is finalized, known as the Blue Book, because it used to actually be a blue book. And then the governor's budget is introduced to the General Assembly. It's released by January 31st this year. In years where there's a transition and a new governor is seated, then the budget isn't isn't released until March. They get a little extra time, so a few extra weeks to get a budget together if it's a new administration. So early to mid-February, the budget bill is actually introduced in the House. OBM provides budget testimony in the House Finance Committee, and the bill is broken up as previously discussed into subcommittees, and the legislative process goes through the House. Agency directors will testify at the subcommittee level. Some directors, depending on the policies and if there are big policy changes, some directors may testify at the finance committee level rather than a subcommittee, or in addition to a subcommittee. So if there's particularly if there's big changes, big tax policy changes, or education is another example where there's been testimony in the finance committee directly. But that goes, February through April. And typically around April, the House will pass their version of the budget, goes to the Senate, and the Senate has a similar process. April through June. The Senate has typically has kind of changed how they assign the budget. Some years, some budgets, the Senate has had finance subcommittees. Some years they have not had finance subcommittees. So I think it's really the preference of the chair. But it's a very similar process to go through the Senate budget hearings. And then the Senate will put forth their budget proposal. And then there's a conference committee in June to work through the differences. So mid-June, the members of the House and Senate that are put on the conference committee will work through all of the differences in order to get us a final budget by June 30th. And then starting July 1, it's implementation time. So there have been a couple biennia that we didn't have a budget July 1. We had interim budgets, but we always strive for that July 1 date. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really helpful to understand each step of the process in detail. And I know folks can continue to submit questions in the Q&A, but I have had a couple of minutes this morning to look over the guidance for the state budget that was released yesterday. And one piece of that stuck out to me was a really big focus on looking at evidence to support the budget. I think you call it the results-focused budgeting, and seeing some resources for data to support budget requests. So wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and also perhaps ways that different stakeholders can help contribute to that, because I think aside from a lot of the data resources that are listed in the budget guidance, lots of our organizations have gathered data about the impact of how state dollars have what those have meant to communities across the state.
Sure. So Governor DeWine is always striving to make data-informed decisions, right? So we have, meetings, and I was at the Attorney General's office when he was Attorney General, and anything that we, tried to do, it was always, why do you think this will be successful? How do you know that this will work? How can we make a bigger impact? What are other states doing? So I think, it's really important to Governor DeWine. It's, equally important to Lieutenant Governor Husted that, we focus on the data and what do the data tell us and how do we know that we could be successful. So, so we really wanted to integrate that into the budget process because we know agencies are doing this already. So agencies that get federal funding have to report on their evidence-based practices, right? There's a big push at the federal level for that. So with this budget guidance, what we were looking at is how do we integrate that into the state budget? And how do we, get the information about the great work that our agencies are doing, partnering with, our communities, and really tell the story of how budget dollars can impact our communities in a real way. So that's the goal of our guidance and integrating that.
Thank you so much for that answer, Christina. I'm looking forward to diving into that budget guidance this afternoon. We do have a question from the chat. How do the ARPA dollars or other federal COVID relief dollars play into next budget or any of the agency requests?
Sure. So we have appropriated lots of the money from the American Rescue Plan Act. Some funding was direct to agencies, Medicaid, health, had, specific programs that were either increased through the American Rescue Plan Act or new funding through that. Education is another. And then there is the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which the governor's office has been working with the General Assembly to appropriate. Some have been through other pieces of legislation. Some have been, appropriated through controlling board. So I think looking at the needs and the requests and figuring out which pot of money is appropriate to for that particular need is one of the central roles of OBM. So looking at all of the needs and then looking at all available funding and kind of piecing that puzzle together is something that we'll do over the next 4 months.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And as we wait, we're still open for questions through the Q&A or through the chat, but do have one question for you, Assistant Director, with your time and your experience kind of in the state legislature at different levels. What would you say to a new advocate who's kind of approaching their first state budget process, how to plan, kind of when to get started? I know we heard a little bit earlier from our earlier speakers, but from your perspective, what would you say as advice or maybe inspiration to new advocates out there?
Yeah, I think, really understanding how the work that they do fits in with particular state agencies is important, and making sure that, they understand the processes of state agencies, because all money is appropriated to state agencies, right? And it has to flow through there. So really understanding that is number one. And then, number two is the only really guaranteed piece of legislation that has the, governor's priorities is the budget. So, by revised code and, that he has to introduce a budget. So that is the one piece of legislation that the governor has to, really has the authority to impact by law. And so I think, outside of budget times, I think it's, probably more successful for, community organizations to lobby the legislature than it is the executive branch, but understanding then how the money flows and how all that works, particularly with competitive processes and agencies, making sure that they understand, when opportunities are going to, come up to apply for, grants is super important. And I'll give a little plug for grants.ohio.gov, our website, which we are trying to make easier for local governments, community organizations to see what opportunities are out there. So if you're not already subscribed to get notifications from grants.ohio.gov, please go take a look at it. And if you have any problems, there's an email box on there, and we're happy to help you through it. Any grant opportunities that we can help with.
Assistant Director, this is Will Tarter. Thanks so much for being here, and I enjoyed your presentation a great deal. I have a question. It was a few years ago where I wrote a blog post about the state transportation budget, and a lot of people were not aware that the transportation budget follows a different timeline than the main operating budget. And it is from January through March, and it has to be passed by the end of March. And I was wondering if you could share with us, when is the best opportunity to engage when we are having conversations about the transportation budget? I think transportation is such a big issue when it comes to social determinants of health. And for advocates and organizations that serve the community, knowing when and how to engage on that, I think would be tremendously helpful.
Sure. So from an executive perspective, we work on it all the same time, right? It has a little bit shorter legislative timeline. So the Ohio Constitution says that all bills are effective after 90 days, except when there's an appropriation for operating. So with the transportation bill, it carries that 90-day referendum period. So in order for it to be effective July 1, we have to pass it a little earlier. But we still have sort of the same introduction timeline. So I would say, organizations shouldn't treat it any differently than they would the other operating vehicles. But the legislative timeline is much tighter.
Operating vehicles. I like that. That was timely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's tremendously helpful. I know that, especially when we're talking about social isolation and making sure that people, have access to food and medical, that's a very important issue. And I appreciate you sharing that insight.
Right, we have 2 more questions in our Q&A. So our next one, how does the major budget surplus change this year's process? I know a number of our viewers have been keeping track of the OBM monthly reports. And what precedent does this set for the fiscal year 2026-2027 budget? So not even this budget, but maybe the next.
Sure. So kind of twofold. One of the big changes, impacted by our current budget situation, that you may see in the guidance that was released yesterday is we didn't set caps on agencies and what they could request. So that has been a long precedent. I think, almost 20 years ago when I was a budget analyst at OBM, we had, 2 scenarios, a scenario at a reduction and a scenario at flat. So we did not introduce any caps or restrictions to this year's budget request. And it's in part because of the current situation that we're in. So I think, as we mentioned earlier, the focus on evidence and results is going to weigh heavier into, budget decisions than affordability at this point. But I will say that, Governor DeWine has been very, very diligent at making sure these kind of one-time revenues are spent on one-time expenses. We do not see this as a new baseline. Right. There were many, many things over the course of the last 2 years that impacted revenues and expenses. So we do not anticipate this level of revenue to continue. So we will be looking to, increase one-time things that will not create a budget cliff going into the next biennium. So that is a focus for us to ensure that our revenue projections and expenses are sustainable or one-time investments for, continued benefit for generations.
Certainly, I know that's incredibly important, but no cap, that is certainly news and very, very interesting. Our next question, and the last one we have here on our list for now, is does OBM keep track of dollars that flow from the US Treasury to Ohio and then out to the agencies and then out consequently to local government entities? Kind of how does that flow work of tracking?
So I will, yes. So I think the way that works is, no dollar can be spent from the Ohio Treasury without an appropriation. So every single dollar spent has to have an appropriation from the General Assembly in order for money to flow. So even if it's federal funding, they have to get an appropriation. So the General Assembly really sets what we can spend and what we can't, regardless of the revenue coming in. If you haven't been to the Ohio checkbook lately, I would encourage you to look at the Ohio checkbook. We have a tab out there that shows there's a new tile, or not newish, to show all the coronavirus relief spending. So every grant that has come into Ohio that was dedicated to pandemic purposes is a little tile at the bottom left of the home page, and you can look at that and you can click on it in each particular act and see where the money was appropriated to. So it came from the feds, which agencies it was appropriated to, and then how they spent it. So you can drill all the way down to the transaction level. So I know the CARES Act funding, coronavirus relief fund was a huge dollar amount. A big portion of that came to OBM to pass through to local governments. So you can drill all the way down. You can see how much Cuyahoga County received. I think they received 3 payments. They're the highest, dollar amount received of CRF. And you can see individual transactions. So for some federal funds, we're able to, I guess, show that information in a way that the public could consume it, knowing that there would be a lot of interest. We don't exactly do that with every federal funding source, but we are always open to ideas. If there is something that you're interested in seeing that same sort of trail, there's an email box on the checkbook, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. If there's something that would be helpful to you, we can certainly look into it. We have the state accounting system, and we have a lot of data. We try to put it out there as easy to consume as we can for the information and really the consumption by the general public. Every single transaction from every state agency is out there.
Well, Assistant Director, we want to thank you so much for your time today and for all that you do. We certainly will be sharing all the additional resources that you shared with us today. I know grants.com, I'm sure, is going to get a lot of traffic very, very soon, but we appreciate it. And thank you for your insight and for sharing a little bit of your experience. And I'm sure we will all be digging into that budget guidance in the next few days. I apologize. We had one more last minute question come on in. All right, let me take a quick look at it. All right, very, very quickly from our Q&A. We know that so being a health and human service kind of organization, those are really the issues that we focus on here, both at Advocates for a House Future and with Center for Community Solutions. We know that there's some changes coming in. Excuse me, I'm taking a quick second to look at the question to word it a way that would be helpful. We know that there's advocacy really, again, around kind of those American Rescue Plan Act dollars that are out there. We know that the state has a little over $1.9 billion left in those federal funds. Would you say that those requests or kind of those concerns or advocacy should be directed toward the administration or the legislature at this moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would say both right now, right? This is the time when we're putting together the governor's budget, and the governor's office, has been receiving, requests and proposals and things like that. We are compiling them. We are, looking at them. But I think it is both the General Assembly and the governor's office.
Fantastic. Well, we, again, once more appreciate your time, Assistant Director. Thank you so much for being here. And for our viewers, we appreciate your time as well. As we stated earlier in our presentation, this will be a series. We'll have monthly conversations over the next few months. Our next event, our next webinar will be held coming up on August 17th, again at 10:30 a.m. where we will be focusing more of a drilling down into those health and human service issues. We're excited to have some agency insiders from the administration and executive level here at the state, as well as some advocates who, again, have great experience in the health and human service sector. We've included our link to register for next month's installment, again, coming up in August. And once again, our recording and slides will be sent out. And additional information, some of those links that the Assistant Director mentioned, as well as some additional resources from our previous speakers will be included in that follow-up email. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today, 2 minutes early. Look at that. We appreciate timeliness on a Wednesday. Everyone, we hope you have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and happy planning. We'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone.